So today we are with Chris Magwood in Canada. And Chris, thanks for joining us, Chris, first of all.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So the first time I came across you was when people started commenting on my videos on earth bag homes, and they say, you need to make a video on Strawbale homes. And I'd never heard of something like that. I just Googled it and your name popped up on every single search on Google. And I was just fascinated with the work that you've done and your history in the sustainable home area and all your expertise and all the books that you've written. So we first talked a couple of months ago, and that was before I had started my podcast. So I'm very excited to have you on because you're just a wealth of knowledge in this sustainable building materials field. And I'd love to know more how you got started.
Well, I got started just as an owner builder who, I wanted to make a house for my family that was affordable and good for the planet and healthy for us and efficient and, all of those kind of criteria that people often have when they think about, a home. And so at the time, it feels crazy to say, but there wasn't really internet searches in the early 90s. So my partner and I were looking at books and talking to people and visiting places and just looking at all the things that people had done and ways that people had tried to meet all of these criteria. And we kept going through these cycles of finding out about something, getting really excited, and then really exploring it in more depth and kind of wondering, I don't know if that's really the thing that that
your hopes were dashed.
Yeah. And then kind of the opposite happened with Strawbale. I was at a bookstore and the bookstore owner said, hey, you might be interested in this, and kind of handed me the Strawbale house book that came out in the 90s. And my first reaction was like, no, I'm not interested in that. That sounds way too crazy. But sort of the opposite thing happened. I thought that maybe it wasn't a good idea, but the more research I did, the more I was like, oh, actually, I had all these questions, I had all these criteria going in, and it actually feels like this is going to meet those. And I got less skeptical and more interested. And so my partner and I ended up building the first permitted Strawbale house in Ontario.
And that was in 1996, right?
That's right, yeah. And so we weren't so much thinking that this was a career move, it was just a house, but because of the timing, other people found out that this is what we had done. People started showing up, people started asking questions. I got asked to go do a workshop on a shed, and it just, within a year or two, it had snowballed into a full-time job as a sort of design build. I was part of a small team of 3 of us that ran a design build firm that did a lot of Strawbale and kind of alternative construction things over the following decade.
So you kind of became a guru in alternative construction.
Yeah, if by guru you mean I tried everything, made every mistake possible, and then figured out how to do it better the next time. It wasn't like instant genius. It was, a lot of trial and error. I think the thing that served really well was the notion that we went into our house project with was like actually trying to set ourselves some criteria that we knew we could sort of measure. Like we didn't want kind of like feel good green. If I was interested in indoor environment quality, like I want to know, like, how do you measure the, indoor air quality? What sorts of things make it bad? And so, for all the things, the energy efficiency, we did one of the first energy models for a home in Ontario. And so always trying to look to not just what sounds good or what feels good, but what,
performs well,
performs and is measurably good. And the longer I stayed at it, the better those metrics became, the better my ability to kind of understand what metrics I should be trying to use and finding different ways that people were using to measure these things. So
where do you think that passion and that curiosity came from? Because it's easy to make something that looks environmentally friendly or green and limit it and just market it as environmentally friendly. But you went a step beyond, and like you said, the numbers matter to you. the performance mattered to you? And why? Like, what drove you to get to that level of detail?
I think maybe I'm just that kind of person, but also I felt kind of I felt that I had gotten greenwashed a lot in my own house project. Everything from, you know, the architect who was involved in the plans to the everybody trying to sell me products. You know, the mid 90s were sort of the boom of like green construction, and suddenly like every single product had some sort of green leaf or green flag on the label, and you know, everything was touting its environmental, you know, benefits. And so a lot of that was, again, making mistakes, like buying into some of that advertising, and, you know, getting a paint or a caulking that was supposed to be healthy, and then opening the can and like the smell made me want to vomit. And it's like, well, wait a minute, like how is this green? And so I think, you know, a lot of that was just me realizing I can't take anybody's word on this, you know, or at the time I felt that way. And so if I'm going to get this right, I'm going to have to figure a lot of that stuff out for myself.
So like you said, this was before the internet and information was as easily available as it is now. So how were you able to seek out all this important information, and how were you able to educate others on what was truly green, what was just greenwashing?
That's a good question. I mean, you know, amazingly, information moved around before the internet. And
Yeah.
so there was, you know, attending conferences, there was, you know, phone conversations with people, there were meetings with folks, there was a lot of, you know, reading of books. You know, the Healthy House book came out around that time, Prescriptions for a Healthy Home. So, you know, there was information. It just wasn't as quickly at your fingertips, but in a lot of ways that information was could be a bit more reliable, because, you know, if somebody's going to publish a book on how to make a healthy home, they really researched it, and a publisher got behind them, and there was, you know, an editor and at least some level of verification, versus, you know, today where it's like,
Yeah, I took 10 minutes to write this article.
make a slick website, and like suddenly you're selling, you know, a green building idea. And I think there's great things about the way that that's happened, but you know, there was information out there. It was just a little harder to find it. But when you did, it was often really good, really thorough, really well researched, and so, you know, provided a lot of a good base for understanding.
So you started the Endeavour Centre. Was that in the early 2000s?
The Endeavour Centre started in 2011.
2011. Okay. And that was just you taking all the information you learned through your own self-builds, through your talks, through your research, and wanting to educate more people and spread information out faster.
Yeah.
So what did you have what sort of courses did you have at the Endeavour Centre?
The sort of the core of the Endeavour Centre was based around a half-year-long course where we actually built a building from start to finish with the class. So they were kind of there through the entire process, you know, got hands-on experience with all the different sort of materials and systems, got to see, you know, how all that stuff works when the building inspector comes to the site, and you know, how tradespeople get incorporated into all of that. So it was this very sort of holistic, hands-on approach to learning that. And then that was kind of augmented by lots of shorter workshops that were focused on a particular material or a particular subject. So, you know, a weekend workshop in hempcrete insulation, or, you know, natural plasters or earthen floors and things like that. So the center was a mix of, you know, that long, you know, education of seeing a whole building, or just, you know, people being able to pick the subjects that were of interest to them and just do a focused dive into that.
So like you just mentioned, you weren't just diving into Strawbale homes, and you didn't think that was the one solution fits all to all problems, but you were also an advocate, or you are an advocate for hempcrete and hemp insulation. What other products do you identify as sustainable building materials?
I think that just trying to define that, is a,
It's tricky.
it's yeah, because one, I realized working with people on their designs early on that people would come to us with, this notion, I want to build a green home or a sustainable home, or, whatever overarching term they used, that could mean very different things, even though people are using the same term. So the thing that sort of came out of the building business and then got formalized at Endeavour was, we kind of came up with what we called our criteria matrix. And so we realized there are about 10 different things that people meant when they said green. For some people that was energy efficiency, for some people that was like doing the least harm to the planet and its ecosystems, for some people it was building health, so that there are all these different aspects. And what we realized is, depending on how people prioritize all those different aspects of a green building, you make them a different building. So, a straw bale building was not always the solution. A hempcrete building was not always the solution. The solution was find out what mattered to the person sort of commissioning this building, find out what their most important criteria are, and then you use the materials that get you the building that does that. So, in our criteria, were also things like, do you want this to be fully building code compliant, or are you willing to go through some alternative compliance, pathways?
To
You
maybe
can
get a more
good building out of either one
Okay.
of these, but if you don't want to take, say, the extra time or spend the extra money, or want the hassle of going down the alternative compliance path, then a straw bale building might not be for you. But if your reasons for thinking about a straw bale building were that you wanted great indoor air quality, you wanted local materials, you wanted vapor permeable wall system, like, we can also do that with dense packed cellulose insulation and a wood fiber board outside, and we can hit the same R values, and we can be non-toxic, and we can be vapor permeable, but all within code, being code compliant. And so, that it's sort of like a pick your own adventure book, where the kinds of choices that were most important to people end up choosing the materials. And so, for a lot of the design process for me is being sort of like the annoying 3-year-old who just always asks why. So if somebody comes to me and says, I want a straw bale house, my first thing isn't, okay, great. It's like, why? Like, what is it about that attracted you? And like, just keeping, like, every answer, I'll just do why again until it's like, okay, now we're at the root of this. And now I understand why. So now let's build back up from there to make sure that all of the choices around the design and the materials are answering those critical questions, rather than feeling like this thing does, so going for it.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, like get to the core reason of why you're doing this build, and your client may not have even known the reason that they were doing this, but by you prodding them and getting to that core reason, that's how you got there. So
and it's true. Quite often, people their eyes kind of got open to criteria that they hadn't even thought about, right? Like, indoor environment quality, what's that? Like, and then once you start explaining it, they're like, yeah, of course I want a house with no toxins, but I hadn't even considered the fact that was even a problem. But now that you've mentioned it, actually, that's my number one priority, or, that's like among my top priorities, because of course I don't want chemical off-gassing in my house, or, I want really good water. I want, all those things that support my own health. So yeah, it's, letting people know what all those core choices are, and then let the material selections kind of flow from meeting those.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around how you conduct these projects, and all of these projects were in Canada, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So a client approached you with the project, and then you tried to decipher what they really wanted, come up with plans. And then your 6-month courses that you provided at the center, were they other people who like third parties and just random people who had signed up for this and then would build this client's home?
Yep.
And what was the client ever involved in the build as well?
Sometimes we actually didn't do a lot of homes with Endeavour. We mostly tried to do public buildings.
Okay.
So we worked on things like outdoor education centers. We did a food bank and thrift store. We did that kind of more public buildings, so that the class wasn't, they were paying to come and learn, but they weren't paying to support some random individuals, house construction. They were sort of also contributing something to the community where we were building, and a building that educated them, but then also goes on to educate all the users of the building. So as much as possible, we tried to sort of find projects that included that kind of more public element.
And I'm assuming many of the people that you trained in these projects went on to build their own sustainable homes as well after their courses.
Yeah, we had people who built their own houses. We had people who started careers either as builders, or more people sort of started businesses as subcontractors because they found a part of what we did at Endeavour. Like I love natural plasters, or I love installing solar, or things like that. So a lot of people kind of found their own specialty and did that. We would always have people who were already either architects or engineers, or building designers who wanted to understand the materials and the approach in a more hands-on way, and so then could kind of start to incorporate that. So we always had a really mixed group of people in those classes.
So while you were running these classes, you also somehow found time to write 8 books on healthy building and sustainable building materials, right?
Yeah.
So what's the content of the books, and how did you manage to structure them?
Well, they're kind of, everyone's a bit different. Some are specifically about a material or an approach. So did a couple of early books on Strawbale construction, done one on hempcrete, did one on prefabricated panel systems. So things that are like a very in-depth look at a particular element. And then a couple buildings were about the approach that I've just been describing. So I did one called Making Better Buildings that is sort of all about those criteria, and then all the different materials and how do they fit those criteria. And then essential sustainable home design is kind of like, how do you take those criteria and kind of turn it into your own house plans. So yeah, they've all been different. The newest book is called Build Beyond Zero, and it's about looking at how do we not just sort of reduce the carbon footprint of buildings, but how can we turn buildings into the planet's 6th major carbon sink. So sort of looking at building as a way to kind of flipping it from trying to do less harm to actually, buildings that do real good for the climate, and then also in all those other ways we've been talking about, people's health and affordability and accessibility and equity and justice and all that kind of stuff. I think there's a real convergence where the kind of climate crisis we're in now has the potential to change how we build, not just for the climate, but in all of those ways. And I'm pretty.
That's very interesting.
That. Yeah.
Yeah. So I read a quote from you somewhere on another interview, and it said that we have to look past energy efficiency and look at carbon use, carbon footprint of buildings, and how like you just described, not just how the building functions and hope that it affects the environment less than it currently does, but actually make it better for the environment. And what are some specific ways do you think that homes could or buildings could actually do that?
Well, from a like a straight kind of carbon accounting point of view, a lot of the materials, a lot of the natural materials that I've spent a long time working with, it turns out, there's more atmospheric carbon stored in those materials than was emitted in turning them into a building material. And so, a well-designed straw bale house or hempcrete house or something like that can actually be a net storer of carbon. So there's actually less carbon in the atmosphere when you're done this building than there was when you started. And so, there aren't many industries where you can do that, where you can sort of keep doing the business that you're doing of building buildings, but actually have a positive climate impact instead of a negative climate impact. So, that's such a exciting possibility, and it carries with it all kinds of, I think, not side benefits, but stacked benefits of
like you talked about equity and other things.
Those natural materials tend to be non-toxic. They tend to come from local economies. They tend to support local farmers and foresters and recycling centers and stuff like that. And they can be put together by people from the community. And if we kind of think about it holistically, there's a way to not just like fix the climate by numbers, but to fix the climate by numbers and in a meaningful way for everybody.
Like the intangible part, that's what you're talking about. So what do you think the biggest hurdle is to achieving that ideal building that actually does good for the environment? Is it that like straw bale homes or hempcrete homes are heavily reliant on manual labor? Is it the learning curve associated with it? Why do you think we haven't widely adopted that kind of building method yet?
I think there's a bunch of reasons. I think none of them are technical. In fact, there are some great companies making prefabricated versions of all of those things where they sort of,
like you talked about the prefabricated straw bale panels.
Yeah. So, the companies making those, they're not relying on, an excessive amount of intense labor or anything like that. I think mostly, I think there's a few things. There hasn't been a compelling reason to make this switch. At best, these approaches, say like prefabricated straw bale panels, are cost competitive. They're basically the same cost as existing approaches to building. So you're not going to save money by doing it, but you also have to change your supply chains. You have to retrain your crew. You have to, there's a whole bunch of work involved in changing it. Even if it doesn't cost you more, why would you put in the effort when there's no financial return? I think maybe now the climate is one of those reasons that might help push more people in that direction. And also,
that's interesting. I'm sorry. Don't mean to interrupt you, but now that you're talking about this, it makes me think about carbon credits. And I recently started diving into carbon credits and how it's very there's a lot of greenwashing going on in that sector. But if we're able to somehow eventually apply that to homes, that could be an added incentive to building better homes. Like if your home, like you say, is actually doing good for the environment and that counts towards certain carbon credits, that's the financial incentive for new homeowners and new builders.
Yeah, and I think there is interesting stuff going on. There's an American startup called Aureus Earth that's particularly looking at offering carbon credits for carbon stored in buildings and building materials. Puro Earth is doing something similar in Europe right now. So I think that is one potential pathway to kind of incentivize if you're not going to make the building less expensive, but you can earn a few $1,000s per building in carbon credits, then that's another motivation. I think another one of the reasons it sounds maybe counterintuitive, but these technologies are actually too simple. They're too easy. by and large, when people invest a lot of money in a new building product or a new building material, they're doing that because they have a patentable idea that, you know, they have intellectual property control over. You put in the investment, you own that idea for, you know, however many decades, and you then recoup your investment. Most of the things, like, you know, say a prefab Strawbale wall company, like there's almost
Nothing
nothing patentable there.
Yeah.
It's really easy, it's really straightforward, but you won't own that technology. You know, you can't sort of be the one to take it to market and kind of own it or control it. And I think, you know, that's one of the things. And there is no big straw, you know, corporate driver behind those sorts of things either. So, you know, it's in the startup world, it's a lot of very, you know, small companies trying to start up, trying to do it for all of these great environmental reasons, but there's, you know, they're not accessing kind of capital in the way that they could if they had a really great sort of like brand new idea that was, you know, somebody could invest in and know that their investment is, you know, going to get this return.
Shiny new thing. Straw is not, it's not shiny and it's not new. It's one of the oldest building materials. So it's hard to excite people with that idea. Yeah. So in your research and your building and all, you've been developing this really cool software called BEAM, and that stands for Building Emissions Accounting for Materials. Mm-hmm. So when did you start developing this BEAM calculator?
Well, I got interested in understanding what the carbon footprint of materials is when I was working on the Making Better Buildings book, because, you know, I was trying to lay out these 10 different criteria for materials, and one of them, I thought, you know, the climate, like we should be like, how does this work? And so, you know, I found a very early database from the UK that attempted to sort of give carbon footprint numbers for materials. And so in that book, I kind of attached those numbers to the materials, and that was really surprising. It was sort of a new metric for me. It wasn't one that I had worked with before, but as I sat with those numbers and started making like some model buildings and applying them, I was like, this is really big. Like, you know, if I choose the wrong materials for a building, its carbon footprint appears to be massive. And so, you know, that just kind of started me down this path of really wanting to understand that, like, was I right? You know, were these numbers right? And so, you know, over the course of a few years of just self-motivated research, and then I went back to school and did a master's degree. In the process of doing that master's degree, I realized, well, I'm going to need to make some sort of tool for me to look at these buildings, because I can't find anything that does what I want it to do. And so coming out of that master's thesis, I kind of had this clumsy spreadsheet tool that I could use, but nobody else could use. But it, you know, it gave really good answers. My academic supervisor was like, yep, you know, you're doing all of this right. Like, all the math is good. And so that kind of just started on the path of, you know, maybe this should turn into something that other people can use too. And so, yeah, it's
taken a while. It's taken about 10 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, the last 2 years of like really intensive focused development time on BEAM. We've had a really small but really good team working on it full time for quite a while now. And it just got released.
And you've chosen to release it for free for anyone to use, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're hoping that people will contribute to it. You know, we didn't want to put it behind a paywall because we want to make sure that anybody could access it. But we're really also, you know, hoping that people who do access it and find it useful will kind of contribute, and that will allow us to keep, you know, developing the tool and stuff. So it's free, but we really hope most people will pay for it.
So right now it calculates the carbon footprint for or building emissions for walls and stuff, but you hope to broaden the scope of BEAM to include MEP systems and other components of a building too. Yeah,
so right now it's got all the materials that you might use for kind of the structure, the enclosure, and the partitions. So, which is, the bulk, like it's the main mass of a building, and it's also the materials where there's the greatest difference between the options. So, the difference between like flooring A or B can be sometimes 10 times, the amount of emissions, or a cladding or an insulation. Like there's some really wide spreads there. So, and the data is the best for those materials right now. But yeah, we really are hoping to expand it also into the mechanical and electrical and plumbing stuff, the things like final finishes like paints and stains and other categories like that.
And
but right now
caulks too, maybe caulks and sealants.
Yeah. But yeah, we sort of concentrated on the sort of bulk materials that in the end I think are still going to make up the majority of the emissions for the building. But we had, that was the place where the data was the best, and the people could make the biggest difference by seeing those numbers.
Yeah. So now that you have moved on from the Endeavour Centre, and you moved on to writing a new book, you moved on to releasing this beam calculator, what do you have in store for the rest of this year and the coming years?
It's a good question. I actually just took on a position at the Rocky Mountain Institute in their embodied carbon program. And so really excited about that to be doing this kind of climate and building related work with a really great international team, thinking a lot more now about how does this show up in policy. So we've now got a tool like Beam that can help a home builder say, well, this is the carbon footprint of my house. Now what we want to do is have cities
standards in the code, maybe.
Yeah, cities, provinces, states, federal governments sort of going, oh, so if we have a target that we need to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030, then we can use a tool like Beam to say, well, this is the carbon footprint of a house today, so 50% less than that in the next 10 years is this. And so starting to work on policy related things that will kind of like connect those two. Now we can generate good numbers for buildings. Now we can sort of generate some policy that kind of pushes everything in that direction.
That seems like an exciting new step in your career. Like you're using all the information you've gained for the past 20 years or so towards like changing policy, changing building codes, and having a larger impact on the building sector. That's very exciting.
It is. Yeah, it is really exciting. It's and I think it's really great to have arrived here from a hands-on
approach,
practice,
exactly, rather than just theoretical.
It's not just an academic exercise where it's like, oh, I made these models and I made this tool, and it's in theory, here's some answers. It's like, well, no, I know how buildings get built. I know how conventional buildings are built. I know how these alternative buildings are built, and so the numbers that we're generating are real. And we can look at them in sort of like worst case scenarios, really average scenarios, best case scenarios, and be able to talk to policymakers about, like, from a point of understanding, like, what will it take the building industry to move in this direction? What are the obstacles? What are the hurdles? Where are the easy wins that you can push quickly? Where are the things that are going to take more time and more support? So
and
it feels like a career of building to a point where I can have those conversations with those different stakeholders in a productive way, I think.
And your experience talking to clients and asking them why is going to help you in talking to policymakers who may not be familiar with all these topics, helping them understand exactly how policy needs to change or why certain things in the policy are ineffective, like helping them understand like the most elemental, simplest part of policy that's truly going to make a difference.
Yeah, I hope so. And then, also trying to learn about what is it like to be a policymaker, and like, what are the realities of that? And I think, my whole career has been pushing boundaries always, like I'm always wanting to try the new thing, but not ever recklessly. Like I want to know what I'm trying to achieve. I want to make a good plan to achieve it. And, from the outside, it might look like, wow, that was a crazy thing you just did. But from the inside, it's like, no, it's not crazy at all. Like,
It made
I
sense.
did the research, I did the thing, we made the plans, we talked to the engineer, like this is all going to work. And so I feel like, I'm starting to figure that out on the policy side too, like, where, there's just so many different ways that at different levels of government that these things can be enacted, and municipalities have some control, but not, a broad range of control, but they have some really direct levers they can pull. The provincial governments also do, the federal governments also do. And so, trying to, make sure that the kinds of suggestions that we're making are appropriate for the level of government that we're talking about.
That's really exciting, Chris. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your whole journey and what you're up to now. It's very exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing the next 8 books that you write over the next couple of years.
Thanks. Yeah, and it's really great to be on your podcast. I'm also a big fan and love checking out your episodes. So thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you.